On the African continent, there are more than 100 indigenous peoples, roughly estimated at 50 million people. They are hunter-gatherers and pastoralists with strong traditional cultures, and they are closely connected to their land. Across the continent, indigenous peoples share extremely difficult living conditions and are victims of human rights violations. For the last decade, the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has taken action to change the situation.
We could rather die on our feet than to live on our knees. This is the spirit that guided the long journey for this community in searching for justice and livelihood.
Baringo District, Central Kenya. Indigenous people from all over the country are gathering here in large numbers. They are invited by the Endoroi people to celebrate a victory.
We felt now we are new again as community. We felt now we are now human. We feel now human like any other person.
Today they are dancing and singing in joy. 7 years earlier, the Endoroi people, having been evicted from their ancestral land, victims of injustice and poverty, took their case to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And now, after years of hard work and anxious waiting, the Commission has ruled in their favor. The Endoroi are to be restituted for their losses and regain access to their land.
This is a very important ruling. It's not just a recognition of the land rights of the Endorois, it's a recognition of the Endorois as a people.
The ruling by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is significant not only for the Endoroi. It could spell important changes for other indigenous peoples on the African continent. Banjul, the Gambia, delegates of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights are assembled for the opening of the biennial meeting of the Commission.
Je souhaite à tous et à chacun une très bonne session et que nos débats.
The African Commission on Human and People's Rights was established in 1986. On the basis of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, its task is to promote and protect human rights across the African continent. Among the issues to which the Commission is paying special attention is the plight of indigenous peoples. Since 2001, a working group on indigenous populations and communities has worked intensively to raise awareness on their special situation. The working group is chaired by Commissioner Musa Pitei from the Gambia.
There are special problems connected with indigenous peoples as compared to the rest of the population. They are regarded as backward, very simple-minded, uneducated, and they are even utilized as slaves. They cannot enjoy the rights that are guaranteed under national law and international law. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
During the sessions of the African Human Rights Commission, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations also get together for their own meetings. The Working Group is mandated to study how the African Charter on Human and People's Rights applies to indigenous populations on the continent and to carry out information gathering and sensitization on indigenous people's rights in Africa. In 2003, the Working Group presented a groundbreaking report, which among other things, gave criteria for identification of indigenous peoples in Africa. Though the report was adopted by the African Commission and thereby by its member states, those criteria are still debated among the member states of the African Commission.
If you go into many African countries, the typical answer or reply that you get is, oh, all Africans are indigenous. But indigeneity is not something static, and it has been defined clearly in the African context that indigeneity is not defined as being first people, as it is in the case of the Aborigines in Australia or the Indians in North America and South America. It's not in that sense that indigeneity is defined in Africa. Indigeneity is defined within the context of marginalization to a specific social group, particularly in the traditional community.
I see. Indigenous people in Africa is a concept which identifies certain societies by the way they live, their attachment to the land, which is connected to the way they live, their culture, their religious beliefs. Is the characteristics of the population which makes that population self-identify as indigenous populations, and the rest of the society also identifies them as such.
In the bustling streets of the Cameroonian capital, Yaoundé, there are hardly any traces of indigenous peoples inhabiting the country. Nevertheless, approximately 1.5 of the 19 million Cameroonians defines themselves as indigenous. Most of them live lives very different from life in the big cities. With modern and extremely effective machinery, foreign logging companies, with the consent of the Cameroonian government, are cutting deep into the jungle. As in the rest of Central and West Africa, the diverse forests of Cameroon is disappearing at an alarming rate, and for the 44,000 hunter-gatherers still living in the country, consequences are severe. Among them are the Begili, who depend on the forest for food, firewood, building materials and medicines. For them, the good life in the forest is already a treasured memory.
Surtout d'abord, comme nous sommes là maintenant, hein, voilà les arbres traditionnels qui sont en train de fuir. Nos enfants, même que nous sommes en train d'accoucher là, ne vont pas voir ça, ne vont même pas connaître ça. Les lianes même que nous avons, on avait eu à voir dans la forêt, ne vont même pas voir ça. Les gibiers même qu'on avait eu à voir dans la forêt, ne vont même pas voir ça. Donc ça nous dérange dans le cœur que nos enfants eux-mêmes ils n'auront pas la même vie que nous avons eu à mener avant.
The Begili can no longer live in the forest, and their access has been significantly restricted.
Le problème dans la communauté, le problème le plus grave, c'est d'abord le problème foncier. Parce que lorsque nous étions en forêt, on n'avait pas de problème. La forêt, on sait que la forêt, nous sommes libres de mener nos activités librement. On fait la chasse, on fait la pêche, on fait la cueillette, on fait la collecte, on fait tout. On pêche même dans les rivières sans que personne n'arrive pour nous dire qu'ici, là, il y a des limites. Il ne faut pas déborder.
As the economic interest in the forest increases and new stakeholders take over, the Begili are slowly being squeezed out of their ancestral land. Though the Cameroonian constitution, as one of the few in Africa, does recognize the existence of indigenous peoples, this recognition does not show in the country's legal system. The relation to land and livelihood system of the Begili and other indigenous peoples is not taken into consideration.
Le principal problème des peuples autochtones des forêts du Cameroun, c'est l'absence de reconnaissance officielle comme groupe ayant un mode de vie distinct. Et cela se traduit dans les textes de loi en vigueur. Par exemple, dans la loi foncière, il est clairement mentionné que pour avoir accès à la propriété, il faut au préalable l'avoir mis en valeur. Et la mise en valeur suppose qu'on construise une maison ou qu'on mène des activités agricoles, qu'on fasse des champs. Et ces pratiques-là ne sont pas conformes au mode de vie des Begili ou Bakar, Bakola, qui en général mènent des activités qui ne laissent pas de marque sur l'espace, par exemple la cueillette, la chasse et d'autres activités de ce genre.
On the small patches of forest to which the Begili still have access, they are able to uphold some hunting and gathering activities, but the yield is getting scarce.
C'est le gouvernement qui nous a fait sortir de la forêt. On vit seulement de la chasse et de la cueillette. Mais aujourd'hui, alors que nous sommes sortis de la brousse, nous n'avions plus cette opportunité de mener nos activités. On sera obligé maintenant de s'adapter à l'agriculture petit à petit.
Being a center of East African modern economy, the Kenyan capital Nairobi is also a melting pot of different peoples and cultures. The 40 million Kenyans speak no less than 62 different languages. Kenya is home to more than 20 different indigenous peoples. One of these being the Endoroi. Wilson Kipkazi is working with the Endoroi Welfare Council. He is on his way to meet elders in a village in the Endoroi land. They are going to discuss the implementation of a ruling by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights.
People have high hopes of getting back the land, and probably the management of the said Lake Bogoria became reserve, which will come back to the people. And people believe as a result of that, definitely their lives will change forever.
The ruling by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights is a result of a long-standing court case. It started back in the early 1970s, when the Endoroi people were evicted from their ancestral land around Lake Bogoria because the Kenyan government wanted to establish a national park in the area. The Endoroi sued the Kenyan government. After a long, fruitless journey through the courts of Kenya, the case ended in the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Finally, in 2009, the Commission ruled in clear favor of the Endoroi. The ruling gives recommendations on how the Kenyan government should restore the rights of the Endoroi people.
My job is to organize the community. Suppose the government gives back the land to the community. We should be prepared from the ground. The moment we have any development, we pass information, and they are progressively following the progress of the case and the implementation.
Losing their pastures has taken a toll on the Endoroi pastoralist community, numbering around 60,000 people. When they were evicted from the area around Lake Bogoria, they were deprived not only of their traditional way of life and their culture, but also their livelihood.
Before they were evicted, they used to have huge herds of cattle and goats, sheep, donkeys, and people were better off in their own livelihood that they used to experience. But when the people were pushed out, they were pushed to a worse environment. So people became poorer than they were, and they have not been able to comprehend the situation today.
In Tanzania and Kenya.
At the biannual meetings of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations and Communities, the members share information on each of their areas of responsibility and plan their future activities. Between meetings, the group members regularly undertake country visits to have discussions with governments and other stakeholders and to investigate the situation of indigenous peoples on the ground. The group members also organize sensitization seminars for indigenous and government representatives. They carry out research in collaboration with relevant international and African organizations and universities, and the findings are published in reports.
And other important issue that this meeting will have to look at is...
Among the difficult issues often occupying the working group members are land rights. Across the continent, indigenous peoples experience pressure on the land they live on.
Invariably, the areas where they occupy are areas in which you have very valuable natural resources like timber, gold, mining, etc. And the government thinks that those natural resources belong to the nation as a whole. And with drive to modernization, there is no patience to balance the competing interests.
Everything that is connected with so-called modernization is all borrowed from the colonial construct. In Africa, the African elite is taking a great deal of advantage of this construct and abuse the rights of indigenous communities by taking over their land, for example, by chasing them out of their habitats in cases of forests, and use that forest for a number of reasons. Logging is one big problem, tourism is another, and so on and so forth. So the natural resources of indigenous peoples has been abused and exploited by the elite for many, many years.
In my understanding, land and recognition are very, very closely interlinked. And the other rights are really sort of derived from these two main pillars, in my understanding. Because if you have to design measures for indigenous access to health, to education, to employment, you can only make appropriate design of any measures within the context of their land rights and within the context or framework of their recognition.
In order to redress injustices and promote indigenous people's rights, an important task for the working group is to point out best practices. And around the African continent, there are examples to highlight.
You will find states which have recognized some land rights to indigenous peoples. We can name cases of South Africa, for example, where part of national park was given to the San, restituted to the San. You can have countries like Congo-Brazzaville, which is drafting a law on indigenous peoples. You can also name countries like Cameroon, which has the word indigenous in its own constitutions.
The very crucial, the key best practice, in my view, is to recognize indigenous populations as such. After recognition, then there should be implementation.
Some 250 kilometers northwest of the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, the road from Nakuru leading westward tells a dramatic story. Kilometer after kilometer, a huge mountainous and moist indigenous forest has made way for thousands of new settlers, farming small plots. Big-scale industrialized agriculture has also found its way into the area. The enormous influx of settlers in the last huge rainforest in Kenya, the Mau Forest, has squeezed the indigenous inhabitants, the Ogiek people, further and further into the shrinking forest. The Ogiek, a hunter-gatherer group estimated to be approximately 20,000 people, solely depend on the forest for food, medicine, shelter, and preservation of their culture.
So Ogiek ko setimto ko yuwa guri yenyua. Amuise timto en Ogiek ko yu kele oguriet ko nyomtit. Muise timto ko ikibit tuchita guri en Ogion in oritab timto.
Without title deeds to land, and with still less forest in which to live and hunt, the Ogiek are facing serious problems. The new settlers, who with more or less dubious title deeds have taken over the land, have displaced them.
The stage where we are as Ogiek, we are actually trying to survive. Reason being, we are still on the basics. the basics of shelter, food, and clothing. We have never had our land rights up to today being given title deeds. The Ogiek people have undergone evictions after eviction.
The exploitation of the Mau forest has led to severe destruction. Now the Kenyan government, under pressure from other East African nations, has started to relocate people and re-establish the forest area as a watershed to avoid an environmental and ecological catastrophe. The Kenyan government wants everybody out of the Mau forest, including the Ogiek.
The government treats everybody now within the Mau as an encroacher, as a trespasser, as a squatter who needs to be removed at the fastest way possible, and if not on their consent, by force. Because the government says, and you can understand that, the government says that, that the forest has been depleted, and that has serious ramifications, to the environment of the entire country. So the Ogiek are caught within that larger struggle.
Since the settlements in the Mau forest area began back in the early 1980s, the Ogiek have tried to fight their case in the courts of Kenya, but so far with no luck. Now the Ogiek have joined forces with the young Nairobi-based lawyer Korir Singoi, who was part of the team that won the case for the Endoroi.
What we want to do is to bring the Ogiek together. We think that is the most fundamental issue. We want to work with the community to develop, to organize the community.
In Cameroon, the government policy has exactly been that of moving the indigenous hunter-gatherers out of the forests and into already existing Bantu villages, where they are allocated small plots of land to cultivate. The idea is to assimilate them into the lifestyle of the dominant society.
Ils ont été sortis de leur terre ancestrale pour être installés le long des pistes. Et aujourd'hui, quand ils sont arrivés, ils ont trouvé que les Bantous y étaient déjà. Et c'est ce qui davantage rend précaire leur droit à la terre, parce qu'ils ne sont pas considérés comme étant chez eux. Et c'est de là que partent même toutes les brimades qu'ils rencontrent aujourd'hui. Parce qu'en général, quand l'un d'eux veut mener une activité sur un espace, on dit tu dois demander ma permission, tu n'es pas chez toi ici, il faut retourner là où vous étiez auparavant.
Angeline Ntsi and her people were displaced from the forest in the early 90s. Since then, their lives has changed dramatically.
Quand on reste ici, on n'a pas vraiment l'opportunité de mener nos activités comme il faut. Ici, là derrière, on ne peut pas aller à la chasse là-bas. On ne peut pas aller pêcher sans l'autorisation peut-être des Bantous qui sont nos voisins.
Ils sont venus de la forêt et l'administration, le gouvernement nous a dit qu'on doit les placer aussi en bordure de la route à côté de nous. Et je leur ai approprié 2 hectares de terrain.
Angeline Ntsi has asked for a meeting with the Bantu chief. Among other things, Angeline is unhappy with the size of one of the plots the Bagili have been assigned.
La dernière maison de Mazigue Joséphine, je ne pensais pas que c'est vraiment 2 hectares du terrain. 2 hectares de bouche, mais pas les vrais 2 hectares. Parce que normalement c'était 2 hectares, mais maintenant ça devient 2 hectares de bouche.
Je ne sais pas si on pourra reprendre le mètre.
100 mètres, ça se comprend.
J'ai donné. Vous voulez quoi encore? Est-ce que votre objectif c'est venir faire un envahissement ou arracher?
Pas pour arracher.
Alors?
Displaced hunter-gatherers, like the Begili, still rely on the food they can find in the forest. But even with the supplement of crops from the pieces of land they have been given, they often go hungry. To survive, they have to work for their Bantu neighbors, some of whom treat them abusively.
Ils les utilisent dans leurs champs. Au quotidien, ils vont mener des activités et ils sont très mal payés. Très souvent, une journée de travail est récompensée par un sachet de kitoko, c'est du whisky local, ou alors par rien du tout, des vêtements usés. Donc on ne peut pas dire que les relations entre Bantu et Bagili soient équilibrées. C'est comme une relation justement de maître à esclave, parce que s'il faut tout le temps rendre compte à quelqu'un de ce qu'on a eu à faire, s'il faut qu'on ait l'autorisation d'une personne pour aller discuter avec une autre, ça montre clairement que ces personnes-là ne sont pas libres.
Ils ne sont pas des esclaves. Hein? Ce sont les êtres humains qu'on a pu prendre à leur apprendre à faire comme nous. Ils ne sont pas forcés.
In Cameroon, the Bagili are not the only indigenous people experiencing strained relations to their neighbors. The Imbororo, a nomadic pastoralist people, have moved between north and south in the country for centuries. But the 1.2 million Imbororo in today's Cameroon are still regarded as intruders when traveling with their herds.
Min ummoyto Fumbot emin ɗon gaɗa eggi tati daga Fumbot warki ɗo Godorong. Min meeɗi ummoyaki Fumbot dow laawol ɓe jaɓi min na'i tati dow laawol. Min ngari ɗo min kuuli ɗo yamɓe taɓi mi jemma naki ndesan min gutori ɓe jaɓi min boro sappo.
Les Bororo sont considérés comme des étrangers malheureusement au Cameroun. Ils n'ont pas de place du tout. Bien sûr, ils sont des Camerounais. Ils ne s'intègrent pas dans les villes comme les autres. Ils n'ont pas bénéficié de l'éducation parce qu'ils vivent très loin des centres, des infrastructures scolaires. Ils ne s'expriment pas en français. Ils ont donc des difficultés à communiquer avec les voisins, avec les communautés locales.
According to Cameroonian law, space for cultivation and for grazing is to be secured on state-owned land on an equal footing, but this law has never been carried into effect.
La communauté que les Bororo trouvent sur place pense que c'est leur droit de demander des rançons ou bien de négocier avec les Bororo pour leur laisser passer avec leur bétail. Ou alors d'occuper une terre ou une zone quelconque. Mais ce que nous savons, c'est à l'État qu'appartient la terre. Ça n'appartient pas aux populations quelconques. Donc, je me dis, la communauté locale ignore également les textes du pays. C'est pourquoi ils se disent que c'est à eux qu'appartient la terre.
At each biannual session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, both state delegates and NGOs have the opportunity to make presentations on the situation in their countries. In addition to this, member countries are required to regularly put forward a comprehensive country report on their adherence to the African Human Rights Charter.
La lutte contre la pauvreté a ainsi été l'un des principaux axes d'action ou d'intervention du gouvernement.
After the presentations, the 11 commissioners ask questions relating to each of their specific areas of responsibility.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Does the government of the Republic of Cameroon have any intention or plan to recognize and legislate on the rights of indigenous populations?
A starting point for questions asked on the situation of indigenous peoples is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Though a great majority of African states adopted this declaration, many are still reluctant to adhere to its content. Among the issues seen as controversial is the right to self-determination. Some African governments argue that this is likely to spark ethnic conflict and open a road to secession.
What is important within the right of indigenous peoples in Africa is the application of the self-determination is basically to accept the concept of self-determined development. So self-determined development implies that communities themselves define what development means for them, what they want from development, without doing away with their own livelihood system.
The concept does not interfere with the sovereignty of the nation, nor does it validate ethnicity. Rather, it encourages a multicultural approach.
What causes ethnic conflict is the failure to recognize indigeneity. If you fail to recognize indigeneity, then the elite of indigenous communities may start articulating nationalism, then the demand for political self-determination may come. So the whole evolution of ethnicity and nationalism is basically, the basis is exclusion and repression.
In the almost 40 years that have elapsed since the eviction of the Endoroi from Lake Bagoria, they have transformed from proud pastoralists to a poor people scattered on dry and unfertile land in the vicinity of Lake Bagoria National Park.
The greatest obstacles that we have is meeting the daily life food. The cost of school is another problem. The living conditions are terrible. The other thing is this literacy factor is a major hindrance to development. The government never put any facility to improve on education. The government has really neglected the community.
When the government of Kenya gazetted the land around Lake Bagoria, there were promises that the Endoroi people would be compensated. They were to benefit from national park revenues and improved infrastructure, schools and medical clinics, none of which ever materialized. Now, former opponents are going to sit at the same table to plan the implementation of the ruling.
The time frame that the African Commission has provided in the decision is 3 months. 3 months for the government to show that it has begun to do something with regard to moving forward with those recommendations. And we intend to hold the government accountable, for that.
Ogiek means caretaker of all plants and animals. And the Ogiek, who originate from the Mau forest, hope they can be allowed to stay when the Kenyan government continues its efforts to save the forest. But so far, the plans do not take the Ogiek situation into account.
Part of the difficulty right now is the fact that the government is lumping the Ogiek together with everybody else. And what the government, in our view, should do is to consider very carefully the Ogiek situation. And so far, they haven't done that.
The impetuous public debate, the numerous stakeholders, and the various suggested plans for the restoration of the Mau Forest complex have created deep frustration among the Ogiek.
Yani seba nikinte yuko magitinde che ko huru amgile njine mara ingonye narawa ni boy kunyoge nyino ngele njine gingongisi ogie kunyono ngingongisi ogie ko beto cha nyondo yuki obe ogie.
The Ogiek have knowledge, they have understanding, they have traditional structures that the government can draw on in order to conserve the Mau. But the government isn't doing that. It doesn't have the patience, nor perhaps the capacity to even appreciate that community knowledge is relevant to this question. So I do think that the government is well-intentioned. However, it is ill-informed in the way in which they are approaching the whole issue.
Nadine Mbala is on her way to visit the Bagili community living surrounded by soccer palm, one of the largest plantations for the extraction of palm oil in Cameroon. The forest in the area has been cut down to make way for the monoculture crop, without asking or even informing the indigenous communities who have lived there for generations.
Pour manger maintenant, c'est difficile. Dans les petits endroits que nous faisons, même les champs, on n'a même plus. Nous faisons les champs maintenant, les petits. Tu peux faire un petit champ comme ça, un petit endroit comme ça. Ce champ-là, nous vivons mal. Nos enfants, on n'a même pas la nourriture, on n'a pas, les nutritions, on n'a pas. Nous vivons très mal maintenant là.
Part of Nadine Mbala's job as project coordinator at the Center for Environment and Development in Cameroon is to promote indigenous people's rights. Today, she collects data from the Bagili as they have never been registered as official citizens of Cameroon.
Je prends les noms de la communauté, des membres de la communauté en fait, pour essayer pour faire le recensement. Parce que la plupart du temps, on se rend compte qu'ils ne savent même pas combien ils sont. Donc pour moi, c'était un moyen de détourner déjà de savoir qui est membre de la communauté, mais aussi parce qu'ils ont droit, comme tout le monde, à avoir des pièces officielles.
The fact that they are not in possession of official documents like birth certificates and ID cards means the Bagili are left out of the society in which they live. And without documents, people from the Bagili community have not been able to claim compensation from Sokopam.
Depuis que la Sokopam nous a trouvés ici, qu'il nous a trouvés comme nous sommes ici, on a déjà mis du temps ici, beaucoup des années, nous sommes ici, nos arrière-parents sont morts ici. Nous sommes déjà de longtemps. Comme ils ne font que continuer pour prendre leur forêt là, zéro, ils ne nous ont même pas donné quelque chose, zéro.
Il est important d'avoir des pièces officielles parce que celles-ci confèrent la citoyenneté à tout individu. Et aussi, elles peuvent permettre de réclamer ce qui est dû à une personne au cas où elle est lésée dans ses droits.
Charles Kamuren and Wilson Kipkazi have arrived in Gambia at the session of the African Human Rights Commission. They are to update the working group on indigenous populations on the latest developments regarding the implementation of the Endoroy ruling. They also want to seek support for the challenges ahead.
This is a very important body that we channel our issues. And when we are channeling our issues to them, it's like we are channeling our issues to African Commission and as well as AU. So this working group is really very important and it's very relevant to us.
Reception of indigenous representatives serves as an important source of information to the members of the working group on indigenous populations.
The community Endorois in Kenya did receive the ruling from African Commission with a lot of joy.
The Endorois case is likely to be a best practice in Africa, and it's a fruit of something which is taking place on the continent.
The significance of the African Commission's ruling on the Endorois question is enormous. And now it seems that many indigenous organizations are encouraged to take their case to the African Commission. So it has raised enthusiasm.
I can only see it going further because this is a decision, after all, of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, which, legally speaking, is the legal advisor to the AU on human rights issues.
Positive trends towards recognizing indigenous rights in Africa may also open up for discussions among the indigenous peoples themselves. Less pressure from the outside will stress the obligation to look into the human rights situation within their communities.
They still don't see the internal dynamics, their own internal problems, such as exclusion of women, violence against women, sometimes violence against children. But once you have recognition, then that resolves the ground to look into their own internal dynamics.
Lake Bogoria National Park is a place of stunning beauty, and it is a famous tourist attraction in East Africa. The natural environment surrounding the lake is ideal for herding cattle, even in the dry season. For the Ndoroy pastoralists, this land holds the promise of a brighter future.
It's huge resources, and I believe this will make the lives of our children better by going to school, because this money will make us earn a living, educate our children, and continue having good life like any other person as a result of our own natural resources, because we don't need people to give us handouts to survive. No.
Besides giving the Ndoroy access to their ancestral land, the ruling by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights states that the Ndoroy must be given a share of the revenue from operating the Lake Bogoria Hotel and the National Park. The Ndoroy will benefit not only directly by income generated from the tourist industry in the area, but also indirectly from the creation of new jobs in the hotel business and in wildlife management.
Most communities are very reasonable. They understand the limitations and they understand the trade-offs between national development and their own community development. And a lot of communities are willing to compromise for the sake of the larger good, the public good. But they will only come to that place when they are respected, when their rights are recognized, and when they can sit across a table, with a decision maker, within the context of equality and parity.
We shall sit with the government, we shall negotiate the way we have been told by African Commission. I dream that the government will come in also in an humble way. We are also there in an humble way. We sit together the best way of implementing this. We are very much willing. We have systems, we have ways. When we sit together, there will be way. Where there is will, there is way.
Indigenous rights provides a platform through which the state can engage much more directly with communities. What that does is to bolster a sense of national ownership, and belonging. And apart from that, contributing towards addressing conflict, it really goes a long way towards, invigorating people to contribute towards building their own country.
In the central province of Cameroon, Mbororo leaders have come together to discuss the problems facing them. They are a proud and wealthy people, and as pastoralists in many other African countries, their contribution to national economy is substantial. But their limited and conflict-ridden access to land puts a severe strain on their way of life.
hande ɗo jango mo waɗa ngesa ɗo mburtina kwagol kowa mo fuɗita mo waɗa kaɗa e ay mo honima.
The Mbororo call for an implementation of land laws designating land as grazing zones. In the northeast region of the country, they successfully joined a government commission negotiating rules for the use of land. They wish this kind of cooperation to be copied in the rest of the country. To them, the negotiations are an important recognition of their existence.
Ma part, ce que le gouvernement devrait faire, en plus, c'est de considérer les Mbororo comme des personnes à part entière, qui ont leurs droits. de comprendre également leur vie, leur façon de vivre. Après cette reconnaissance, il faut maintenant prendre des dispositions pour leur donner, pour leur faciliter l'accès à la terre. Et les Mbororo, avec leur richesse, pourront véritablement devenir des peuples dignes, qui ont leurs droits, qui connaissent leurs devoirs dans le pays qui les appartient, qui appartient à tout le Camerounais.
A new day is dawning in Angeline and C's village on the edge of the forest. The families are slowly starting up daily activities. Bertin Bu is a school teacher. He is preparing the classroom for the lessons of the day. Not many Begili children attend the public primary schools, which are few and far away. Therefore, the Begili have established their own schools to prepare the children for more education.
C'est une école qui prépare surtout les enfants de la forêt, donc les Badjeli, même les Bantous qui sont dans les campagnes. Donc c'est une école qui les prépare dès le bas âge pour s'adapter à l'école normale, à l'école primaire, pour mieux fréquenter l'école primaire et voire secondaire.
Angeline Nsi knows from her own experience that it is important to focus on education. She wants her daughter to get an education so that she will be able to fend for herself and for the community.
J'aimerais qu'elle vive comme les Bacheli, tout en respectant les coutumes. Et j'aimerais qu'elle fasse l'école, parce que c'est grâce à cette école que je suis ce que je suis aujourd'hui. Si je n'avais pas fait l'école, je ne devrais pas, dans la société, on ne devrait pas me considérer. Si elle, par exemple, ma fille, elle se limite seulement à la pêche, à la chasse et à la cueillette, ça ne peut pas donner. Donc sans l'école, elle ne peut rien.
Moi, je montre.
Je montre A. Je montre A.
La bonne aiguille, voilà, nano.
Je montre A. Je montre A.
Bon, il m'a croisé. Encore une fois. Mon souhait pour les enfants, c'est vraiment que ces enfants soient capables pour arriver aussi dans des grandes écoles, une université, ou bien aller avoir des grands emplois, oui, travailler comme tout le monde, peut-être voir même à l'État, travailler un peu partout dans les sociétés.
We listened with an open mind to our partners from the Egyptian civil society. And actually, we are very proud.
For Angeline Nsi, Charles Kamuren, Wilson Kipkazi, and many other indigenous peoples, there may still be a lot of work ahead before they have achieved the recognition they wish for. But a dialogue has started, and for both indigenous peoples as well as their governments, the challenge is now to keep this dialogue alive. In this process, they will have the support of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights.
African countries can benefit from recognition of self-determined development by indigenous populations, mainly because traditional production systems can be recognized as part of the national economy. It contributes a great deal to development process of a given country. So you can have an even development in place of an uneven development, you know? But you have to give it time, and you have to give it, really, you have to put real energy into it. But the first thing forward is recognition.
Cet état de fait est renforcé par la disparition progressive des forêts et l'éloignement des centres de santé.
I would want to see that our governments don't marginalize a population because of what is considered to be their backwardness. I'm especially sensitive to that because I don't think anybody liked it when, as colonial subjects, we were termed as backward. So that is my motive, to sensitize people that human beings are human beings, never mind the way they live.
Food and wealth is not life. life is justice. And that is what Endorois has got out of this ruling.
Encouraged by the Endoroy case, the Ogyek in the Mau Forest are now hoping for a solution. In their negotiations with the Kenyan government, the challenge will be to combine the preservation of the forest with the recognition of the Ogyek people and their right to live in the forest. For the Ogyek, this would be the chance to become part of modern Kenyan society and at the same time help restoring the forest.
African governments, African countries are changing. I believe that the more democratic a state is, the more indigenous people would have space within which to navigate, their issues. I believe that any reforms that are taking place within this country or in other countries, they will be more responsive to indigenous people. And so I have a sense of real hope that the future will be better.